Well, hey guys. Last weekend I got the Electro-Harmonix Freeze pedal, which if you're not familiar with it, it basically takes a snippet of your sound and sustains it either indefinitely or until you let off the foot switch, depending on what mode you have it set in. And it's really useful for creating ambient pads and stuff. And so I decided to run the freeze pedal through the effects loop on my EHX Stomp, and I'll talk more about why and how I'm doing that later in this video. But then I've been running it out into my Blues Junior, which is my typical setup when I play here at the house. But one of the things that I use the EHX Stomp for is when I've got to play through headphones, I'll use amp modeling on it for headphones situation. Or when I'm playing at church, I'll use it, the amp modeling and stuff on it to go direct to the house because I don't use an amp there. So I thought it would be cool to create a patch on the Helix where I can still use my setup with the Electro-Harmonix Freeze pedal and stuff for when I'm playing with headphones and whatnot. And since I figured the primary purpose of this patch was for me using headphones, I figured I would take advantage of the stereo effects in the Helix family and create this patch in stereo. And in doing that, I kind of learned a couple things that I thought I would pass on to you. So there's going to be kind of two tips that I learned, which may be super obvious, and some of you may have already known this and figured this out. And if that's you, great. But for some of you, this might be new information, and I figured I would pass it on. So that's going to be the beginning of the video, and then the end of the video, I'm going to talk specifically about the EHX Freeze pedal and how I have that routed and how I'm using that. So if you have a Helix and a Freeze pedal, make sure you watch through to the end because I'll show you exactly how I'm routing that. But even if you don't have a Freeze pedal, these are just kind of some tips that I found that you can use when creating a stereo patch to maintain your stereo signal all the way through your signal path. So the first thing that I realized is that the amp blocks, the amp models on the Helix are not in stereo, which makes sense. Amps themselves usually are not stereo. My Blues Junior is not stereo. Most amps are not stereo. So if I were to use stereo effects and run into my amp, it would sum everything to mono and it would come out as mono, or I would just get one side of that stereo signal coming through the amp. And the same thing happens on the Helix. If you run any stereo effects before your amp and cab block on your Helix, then the Helix is going to take all of that, sum it down to mono, and then keep it in mono through the rest of your signal chain. So if you are using stereo effects, you either need to run them after your amp and cab model, or you need to use two amps and put one amp in signal path A, one amp in signal path B, and then that will maintain your stereo signal, because if you have a stereo effect before your amps, then one half of the signal will go through one amp, the other half will go through the other amp, and it'll keep everything in stereo. So if you found a way to use one amp and run it in stereo, run stereo effects before it and have them still be stereo on the other side, please put that in the comments. I'd love to hear it. But that was kind of what I learned. I don't think there's a way to really do that. And again, that makes sense because if you were to try to duplicate that setup in the physical world, that's the way it would work. So any stereo effects that you're using, make sure that you place them after your amp block or you won't hear them in stereo. The other thing that I learned that kind of relates to that, or I kind of realized that relates to that, is if you are using the low and high cut on your cabinet block, on your cabinet model, which is a great tip and is a great thing to do, but if you are doing that, realize that any effects that come after your cab block are not going to go through that same high and low cut filtering. And with this patch for me, that actually worked out as a plus, because one of the things that I'm running after my amp model is the plateau reverb, which I have set to put an octave above and an octave below. And that octave below is kind of coming through and rumbling a little bit more because it's not being filtered through the low cut that I have on my cabinet model, which in a headphone environment makes it sound pretty epic. So that actually worked as a benefit for me. But I noticed as I was trying different delays and stuff to use, one of the delays I tried was the mod / chorus delay. And it actually has a high cut that you can put on the repeats. And so when I was trying out that delay, I set the high cut to the same setting that I had it on my cabinet model, so that it was still filtering the repeats at that same frequency. And a lot of delays and reverbs and other effects will have some type of tone parameter on it. So you can kind of shape the tone of that effect if it's placed after your cab model and it's not going through the high and low cut. You can kind of shape that effect to the way that you want it. I ended up not using the mod chorus delay. I'm actually using the Elephant Man delay in stereo. I kind of did some other things to open up some DSP space so I could use that. And that is an analog. It's a replica of the Memory Man delay, which is an analog delay. And so the repeats on that are pretty dark anyway, so I didn't have to worry about the high cut on those repeats. But as I was trying some other delays, that was one of the things that I noticed. So again, just to kind of recap, if you're using stereo effects and creating a stereo patch, make sure those stereo effects come after your amp model, or make sure that you use 2 amp models. And then anything that comes after your cabinet model is not going to get the same filtering through the high and low cut if you have a high and low cut on your cabinet model. And so you might need to adjust the tone of those effects in order for them to sit right where you want them to. So now to talk specifically about the freeze pedal. So after as I was researching the freeze, and then after I ordered the freeze and continued to kind of do some research and watch videos and stuff on it while I was waiting for it to get here, as we do, I saw a video with somebody using the freeze where they talked about using a delay and a reverb after the freeze pedal, so that your freeze pedal is going into the delay and reverb. And what that does is it helps it not sound so sterile. So the freeze is just going to kind of take a snippet of what you play and just hold it and sustain it. And so my original plan was to run it after my delays and reverbs. And I was like, I'll just put on a delay and a reverb, get a nice ambient tone, play a chord, hit the freeze, and it'll sustain that. But because all of the delays and reverbs and stuff are captured in the freeze, it's just capturing one split second of that delay and reverb sound. And so the delay and the reverb aren't really moving or anything and interacting with the freeze pedal. And it does sound kind of static. So they suggested running a delay and a reverb after the freeze pedal. So I kind of had to start thinking, okay, how can I create a signal path where I can run my freeze pedal into a big ambient delay and reverb sound, but then still play on top of the drone and stuff that the freeze is creating, and not have all that ambience be on the lead line on the solo stuff that I'm playing, because I don't want that to get washed out. And so the solution that I came up with, and I'll put a picture of my signal path up on the screen so you can kind of see it, is I'm using 2 signal paths. And so the signal path A is just my main tone. So it starts with my amp block, and I'm using the Cali Texas channel 1, which is based on the Mesa Lone Star channel 1 amp. So I've got that first in my chain. Then I have the Elephant Man stereo delay with some modulation on it. And then at the end of signal path A is just a plate reverb, which is set to be just a normal reverb tone. If you had a spring reverb or something in an amp, it's just basically a normal reverb tone. The reason I'm using the plate reverb and not the spring reverb is because it takes less DSP space, and this patch is pretty DSP heavy. So that's signal path A. After my regular delay, after the Elephant Man regular delay, I then have an AB switch. So it's not a Y, it's an AB. So I have a foot switch, one of the foot switches on the Helix is basically switching between signal path A, which is the amp, my main delay, and my main reverb, and signal path B, which is my amp, my main delay, and then it goes into signal path B, which is my effects loop, which has the freeze in it. It's in the effects loop left. And then I have another Elephant Man delay with modulation on it set a little bit longer. And then I have the plateau reverb with an octave above and an octave below set pretty wet to kind of create that ambience. Then after the plateau reverb, it then splits back into, kind of joins back into signal path A, goes through the plate reverb again, and then that's the end of the signal chain. So what that allows me to do is when I'm playing through signal path A, it's just the main straight up amp, delay, and reverb, and I can play that for you. So this is Les Paul Tribute, middle position. Here's just the amp with the main delay and reverb. Then if I switch to signal path B, it's going to go through the EHX Freeze pedal and then through that second delay and that second ambient reverb. So I'll switch. Now I've got it going through signal path B. So you can hear that added delay and reverb ambience in there. So what that allows me to do is it allows me to switch to signal path B, hit the chord or the notes or whatever that I want the freeze to hold and sustain for me, and activate the freeze. So I'll switch to signal path B, play the chord, activate the freeze, so it's going to grab that chord and sustain it. Then I can switch back to signal path A, and I'm still going to get the audio from signal path B, which is the freeze pedal, going through that delay and reverb. That audio is still going to continue to come through, but I'm no longer sending any more signal through that signal path. So now I'm back on signal path A. I can play my lead stuff over it. It's not going to get washed out by all of that ambient delay and reverb, but I've still got that drone from the freeze going through the ambient delay and reverb coming through. So I hope that kind of makes sense. If you have any questions about that, you can put it in the comments. But anyway, that's how I was able to achieve with the effects loop on the Helix and the EHX Freeze pedal, being able to run the freeze pedal through some ambient effects, but then be able to switch back and play over the freeze pedal without those ambient effects so that the lead stuff doesn't get washed out. So I hope this gives you some ideas either on how to create a stereo patch and get the full benefit of all the stereo effects, or on how you can use an EHX Freeze pedal with the Helix. So if you have any questions, like I said, put them down below and I'll answer them, and I hope you have a good day.